probably agree on.
Yeah, the playoff team for sure.
No deal.
I mean, I tell you what, I don't think there was a more accurate state. And
if they struggle again, I mean, I don't think there's any way you can keep Alex Critch, but.
What's going on, y'all? Bud Elliott here, back again for another episode of my summer school series. That's our season preview show on the Cover 3 podcast today. I'm talking Syracuse. I'm going to Cuse Nation. I'm bringing in a new face to the show, but a guy that I've followed online for a long time, Mike McAllister. Mike, welcome, man.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. It's fun to be on and glad to be part of the show. I've listened to the show before, so always glad to be a part of something that you listen to.
Man, you are in desperate need here because I sat down to do my Syracuse stuff, and I'm like, okay, there's a lot of new names. A lot of new
There's a lot of new names. Yes.
Let's so new coach Fran Brown comes in. Has not been a coordinator even before, right? But then again, neither was Dabo Swinney. What are they going to run? I guess we can start offense if you like. But what will they run, and how will this look different than last year?
Well, the funny thing is we've asked Fran Brown and the assistant coaches that exact same question, and the answer that we universally get is whatever the defense can't stop. And that is a great generic answer and very unhelpful for people like us. But we saw a little bit of what I think they're going to feature in the spring game, which is they're going to have some spread elements to what they do. They're going to have I don't think they're going to do a lot of read option, which they did a lot with Garrett Schrader, and he was primarily out of the shotgun in order to help him read the defenses faster and then try to take advantage of his legs. They had a lot of designed runs for him last year, obviously, because that was his primary weapon. That's not going to be the case this year. There's going to be some under center stuff. There's going to be some pro style elements to it. You're going to see some kind of generic stuff that you see in every offense. But largely, I think the plan is to try to get at least 3 wide receivers out on the field most of the time. And a couple of those might end up being tight ends at different times as well, because they've got 2 tight ends that they really like. And they're going to run the ball a lot as well, because they really like LaQuint Allen as their back, and the 4-star prospect that they brought in, Yassine Willis, who's going to be his primary backup. They really like him as well. So they're going to try to get a lot of touches to the running backs and take a little bit of pressure off of Kyle McCord as well.
So they list Jeff Nixon as the OC.
Yes.
But also Michael Johnson, who was already there as the co-OC, although Nixon does not have a co in the title, at least not on the official website. Is that sort of we want you to stay on the staff, you can be a co-offensive coordinator title, or do we think that the offense, I mean, to the extent that we can know, which granted, as you said, they said, we'll just run whatever the defense can't stop, that it'll be more kind of a blending of those two styles, because they certainly appear to have very different styles based on their backgrounds.
They do. I think what you're going to see is Jeff Nixon is going to be the one calling plays. He'll be the one in the booth and talking to Kyle McCord and et cetera, et cetera. But Coach Johnson will be very involved in terms of the game plan and how they're practicing and the strategy and those types of things going into each week. So I do think there was some element of the co-offensive coordinator title going to Coach Johnson to keep him on staff and sort of say, like, you know, we really think highly of you, even though you're coming from the previous staff that was just terminated. There was a level of respect there, I think, from Coach Brown to Coach Johnson. But I do think he's also going to be heavily involved with the game plan. Although I would guess if there was a disagreement that Coach Nixon's probably going to have the final say among those two.
So getting Kyle McCord, I don't know. I'm almost sort of like a 2 things can be true mind. Like Ohio State definitely wanted to upgrade from what we had heard from the Ohio State people, but also Syracuse was literally playing a freaking tight end at quarterback for multiple games last year. Like
that got into a bowl game, literally.
Yes, right. So what did you guys see from him in spring? Where do you think he can improve, and how do you think he fits what they want to do?
I think if you had told Syracuse fans in the middle of last season that you're going to have Ohio State starting quarterback as your starting quarterback next year, that they would have laughed at you. But that's the world we're in. It's crazy how things work out. But Kyle McCord, I think, was what everyone expected him to be when he came here, which is he's a veteran presence. He's really steady. He doesn't overreact to things. He doesn't get too high to get too low. He has the respect and command of the room. The offensive players listen to him. They look to him, kind of a natural leader. And the things that made him a high profile recruit coming out of high school, effortless delivery, strong arm, those types of things, accurate with the ball, you saw all of that. Now, some of the things that Ohio State fans were a little bit upset with in terms of, sometimes with decision making or things like that, maybe that creeped up here and there during the spring, but it's hard to read too much into that. But still, I think you saw that he's got the potential to be the best quarterback Syracuse has had in terms of his ability to throw the football since Ryan Nassib was here, which was 12 years ago or so.
Yeah, and I mean, look, the teams have different needs, right? Ohio State is trying to win games number 14 and 15, right? And if Syracuse wins 15 games over the next 2 years, I think most Syracuse fans, at least I see on Twitter, would probably, be mostly okay with that. I think. Who are the other guys to know on the offense?
I mentioned one earlier, LaQuint Allen, and I think he's going to be featured quite a bit in this offense. Not just what he can do running the ball, but we heard a lot going into last year about what he can do as a receiver out of the backfield. Because the previous year in the bowl game, he caught, I think, 9 passes against Minnesota in the Pinstripe Bowl loss. So you felt pretty good about what he could potentially be as a receiver. I just don't think they featured him as much there as what was expected going into the year. And I think you're going to see some more of that this year with some screens, some swing passes, and even lining him up outside on occasion. And having confidence in a backup like they do with Yassine Willis, as I mentioned earlier, I think that gives them the ability to stretch him out. But the other weapons, we talked about the tight ends that they have with Dan Villari, who was the one you mentioned was playing quarterback last year. He does have a background as a quarterback, signed with Michigan as a quarterback, actually out of high school. But he's transitioned to a tight end, so his body's a lot different, obviously. But he showed some flashes of being a really dynamic offensive weapon last year, had a memorable touchdown run against Clemson that was pretty much the highlight of that entire game for Syracuse. And Aronde Gadsden, who the year before was an All-American. He's back. He got hurt early last season and didn't play for most of it. So that's your 1-2 punch at tight end. You feel pretty good about that. And then they brought in some players from the transfer portal that they're expecting big things in terms of the wide receivers. Most notably, Zeed Haynes from Georgia, who was a highly regarded recruit, a lot of talent. He's coming in and might end up being Syracuse's number 1 wide receiver, is certainly going to be in the mix there. Justice Ross Simmons from Colorado State, who entered the portal kind of late and was pretty highly coveted. Syracuse got him to come in. He's from right down the road, Rochester, New York, about an hour and a half away from Syracuse. So he's coming back home to play. He's certainly going to be someone that they look at a lot. And then Jackson Meeks, who's more of a veteran. Those other guys are a little bit younger. Jackson Meeks has been at Georgia for a few years, but was looking to try to go somewhere where he'd have a larger role than playing primarily special teams, and Syracuse gives him that opportunity. So those are some guys that you look at. Trevor Pena, who was a starting slot receiver and return guy in the previous couple of years, had some injury issues last year. He's back and looked really good in the spring. And then the other name I'll mention is Darrell Gill, who was a freshman wide receiver from Texas last year, who had a tremendous spring. And at different times during the spring, the coaches said that he was looking like their best wide receiver, which when you got 2 guys that transferred in from Georgia and you got a guy who several power programs were after and Justice Ross Simmons coming in, you wouldn't expect that kind of an under the radar recruit going into his second year would be someone that stood out among those guys, and he did. So I think he's going to see the field quite a bit as well.
You might be able to say it's fortunate that Ross Simmons is from right down the road, but I think some of these keeps, we can use that term, like literally just keeping the guys that other programs were undoubtedly interested in poaching. That may have been some of Brown's best work here. Gadsden, if healthy, obviously, like on the market, would have been maybe the top tight end out there in the country. Like that guy can really play, and several of these other guys as well. Let me ask you a question. So let's fast forward 6-7 weeks to ACC Media Day. We're there in Charlotte. Who's the guy who probably won't make first or second team All ACC? That when we sit down to give us the paper, like, damn, I bet you this guy probably gets on it come the end of the season.
Yeah, you wonder if Aronde Gadsden may sort of fall off the radar a little bit just because he was hurt last year. But I think Zeed Haynes is the guy that I look at that could end up having a big year for Syracuse, just because The talent is there. He was clearly the number one wide receiver most of spring, and he wore number 8, which around Syracuse is a big number for wide receivers. Marvin Harrison, most notably, wore that number. Other wide receivers that were very productive. Quentin Spotwood, another one who wore that number. So Steve Ishmael a few years ago when they had their 10-win season and went to the Camping World Bowl, he was their number one wide out. He wore number 8. So that kind of tells me what they think about what his talent level is. So he's someone I could see as someone that kind of flies under the radar a little bit. Most of the other guys, the LaQuint Allens, et cetera, I think are going to be on people's radar. I think Allen's going to be someone who's going to get a lot of votes for first or second team preseason all ACC. But there's a lot of really good backs in the ACC, so maybe he doesn't make it and ends up surprising by having a big year. But otherwise, I think most of the other names are guys you kind of expect and are going to be on most people's radars.
That 2018 Camping World Bowl, just from a personal memory, from a betting perspective, oh my God, did they not adjust that line enough when Greer went out and they had to play Jack House? And I was like, oh, this is guys, like this should be double.
Big mistake. Big mistake.
Extremely so. What positions are you most watching come the fall to see who's going to win these battles?
Offensive line, I think, is really interesting. They brought in several offensive linemen from the transfer portal. Savion Washington from Colorado, Cody Hornsby, Demetrius Weatherspoon, who can play inside or outside. He's 6'7", but he's 340 pounds. Josh Miller is coming in from Georgia. So they brought in several guys who they're expecting to compete for spots and who are all expecting to play. And then they've also kept some of their better offensive linemen from last year, most notably Enrique Cruz, who I don't think gave up a sack in the last 10 games, if I'm remembering that correctly. I could be a little off on that stat, but he really played well down the stretch of the season. Of course, it helps when you run the ball a lot more than you throw it as well when they were playing a tight end at quarterback. But he was a former highly regarded recruit who came to Syracuse and played pretty well last year. Jean-Ray Reed, their junior college center who started, I think, every game last year. He's someone who got better as the season went along and many weeks was Pro Football Focus's top rated offensive lineman at Syracuse for most of their games. So he's coming back. It's just, there's so many new faces and you have a new scheme and you have a new coaching staff, and offensive line has been such a topic here at Syracuse the last several years because it's really felt like that's what's held them back from being a team that's barely getting to a bowl game, just missing a bowl game, as opposed to a team that's getting to 8 wins potentially and getting a better bowl game on a more consistent basis. So that's one. And then defensive line, whenever you're going from a system like a 3-3-5, and I think they're going to run more of a 4-3 as their base, then the roles of the defensive linemen completely change. And they brought in several new faces there as well. Fadil Diggs, I think, most notable from Texas A&M. And we really don't know what's going to happen at defensive tackle. That's kind of the big thing. They brought in some guys, but they were kind of behind some of the incumbents in terms of the depth chart after the spring. So it's just a lot of question marks on both lines of scrimmage, and that's really why I'm curious to see how all of that shakes out going into the season.
They do have a really favorable schedule. For a team that if they play at like a top 50 or top 40, top 35 level, then the schedule is really favorable. If they're, more than that, like top 60, top 70, like power rating level, then less so. But no Florida State, no Clemson, no SMU, and then the non-conference, Ohio, Holy Cross, UNLV, and UConn. In some ways, this reminds me a little bit of what Louisville had last year with Jeff Brom, which is where you usually don't define year one as kind of like the must-win type year. And clearly Brown, with the way he's recruiting, is trying to build for the long term there at Syracuse. And all his comments seem to be like, hey, I want to be here and I'm a Northeast guy and like I can win here. But do you think there's pressure to cash in on this schedule? Because we asked Brom this question on Cover 3 last year at AC Media Day. He's like, look, we're not going to disrespect our schedule, but we know we have an opportunity ahead of us.
Yeah, I think he would probably tell you the same thing. But he, whenever you ask him kind of those global questions, the answer he usually gives is, my main goal is to get better tomorrow. and he's very focused on the details of that. Now, would it be disappointing if Syracuse goes through that schedule? And you mentioned, some of the benefits to that schedule. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't tough games. They got to play at NC State, who's preseason, going to be a ranked team, I think top 20 type team. They got Miami coming in late in the year in the Dome. And even though Miami seems to disappoint most years, they still always have a lot of talent. There's always games where they seem to put it all together. It's just not consistent. So if you get them on the week where they do, that's going to be very challenging. You're playing Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh has largely dominated the rivalry with Syracuse over the past 6, 7, 8 years, even though Syracuse did win last season. And I think Virginia Tech's a team that is interesting in the ACC. So there's going to be challenging games for sure. But not having Florida State, not having Clemson on the schedule, having a lot of your bigger games, quote unquote, at home, and not having a ton of ranked road opponents, I think you feel like the fan base, with all of the buzz that Fran Brown has created, I think would be disappointed if the season ends up at 6-6 or 7-5. If they end up with 8, 9 wins, let's say they go 9-3 and they're in a pretty good bowl game, maybe the third slot in the ACC, and they're kind of right in the mix for potentially being in the ACC title game down the stretch of the season, even if they miss it by a game or two, I think most fans would feel pretty good about that. But yeah, if you end up at 6-6 or 7-5 with the way the schedule lays out, with the talent they brought in and the buzz that's been created, I do think there's going to be a portion of the fan base that's going to be disappointed with that result.
Mike, we'll be following all your coverage on Cuse Nation, man. A lot of really fun position battles to follow here, and just a lot we still need to learn about this team as they embark on year one under Fran Brown. Really appreciate the time.
I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely.